Okay, do you have it?
We're good.
Okay, perfect. Well, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And it's another one of our All Canada editions. And our special guest is Barry Weisleder, who is part of the NDP Socialist Caucus and is also a contributing editor to Socialist Action Canada. And we're going to be, of course, we're going to be talking all things Canada, but we're going to be specifically talking about the NDP. So, Barry, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
And Barry, is there anything in your in that very brief biography that I left out of you that you would like to contribute before I start asking any more questions?
Well, I'm a retired secondary school teacher. I worked for 35 years for the Toronto District School Board and its predecessor boards. I organized a union for substitute teachers back in 1983-84 and led the first strike of substitute teachers at a large school board in Canada, negotiated the first collective agreement and several after that. I was elected to the executive board of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. And then when the provincial government changed our union affiliation to the teachers' federations, I was part of those too. They were less democratic, but that's life. And I've been involved in organizing Socialist Action, which is a revolutionary socialist organization, which is involved in the unions, the NDP, anti-poverty organizations, pro-Indigenous, women's rights, LGBTQI rights, and many other things. So,
as well as being consistently anti-imperialist, not selectively anti-war, but consistently anti-imperialist.
Anti-imperialist. Right? So we stand up for Venezuela's right to self-determination. Against the siege of Gaza, for a democratic secular state for all of Palestine, return of the those who were driven away from their homeland, and anti-imperialist on all continents where we have friends and workers in solidarity who are fighting for the same objectives.
Perfect. And also before I ask my first question, but you also you also ran for the leadership of the NDP or not the leadership per se, like Jagmeet, like what Jagmeet Singh is doing, but didn't you run for try to run for an important position in the NDP?
Well, that question deserves a two-part answer. One, yes.
Go right ahead.
I ran for at different times over the last 45, 50 years. I've run for many positions in the party, winning sometimes. For party executive, including president, vice president. But more recently, I sought the NDP nomination in a provincial election. I won the nomination, but then was rescinded. The Democratic decision was rescinded by the provincial leadership. I also sought the nomination for the New Democratic Party, which is a labor-based political party, as I'll explain in response to your questions, for in a federal election or two. I'm co-chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus, as well as working on the other issues I mentioned a moment ago.
And that provincial NDP where you won the nomination, but then they took it away from you. Was that in was that in Ontario or whereabouts in Canada?
That was in Ontario, in a electoral district just north of Toronto. It occurred about 4-5 years ago. There was really no legitimate reason for removing my nomination. It was at a very well attended meeting in the district at the invitation of the NDP district executive, but they just didn't want to have a radical running for the NDP in that capacity. But the struggle continues.
Unbelievable. And but before I even ask on whether the NDP is the best, well, anyways, that's that is a theme that we're going to be talking a lot about today. So we'll definitely get back to that issue. But all right, but let's get started. So. The first question, then, I wanted to ask you, Barry, since we're going to be talking a lot about the history of the NDP and the different leaders that existed on the federal level of the NDP, the New Democratic Party. So the first question I wanted to ask you was what were some of the social transformative achievements that Tommy Douglas, who's one of the most well-known leaders of the NDP, that helped campaign for Medicare for Medicare for all. But what were some of the social transformative achievements that Tommy Douglas and his successor David Lewis achieved for working class Canadians during their time as leader of the federal NDP?
Well, let's begin by acknowledging that the NDP was founded in 1961 by a fusion of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was a worker-farmer-based protest party in Western Canada.
Yeah.
That went on to form the government of Saskatchewan, a government that was headed by Tommy Douglas, who was a leader of the Saskatchewan CCF, and he became leader of the federal New Democratic Party in 1961, and for 10 years he led the federal NDP. I wouldn't say that the NDP can claim to have engineered any transformative change, but it did fight for some very important gains for the working class, and you named the most famous one, for the public health care system, a single-payer Medicare system. It doesn't include everything. It doesn't include pharmaceuticals.
Dental as well.
Mental health care. It doesn't include many features that we would like to see included in a rounded public health care system, but it's far in advance of the healthcare system that exists in the United States. So that was a giant step forward. Employment insurance, the NDP and its predecessor campaigned long and hard for that, and the Liberals adapted that, establishing a cross-country employment insurance system under pressure from the NDP and the labor movement. So, the Medicare system, employment insurance, and increasing taxes on the corporate elite to fund these essential social programs. So that was quite important. The legacy of David Lewis is more of a mixed bag. Oh, I should add, in terms of federal policy, Tommy Douglas was leader of the party when the party campaigned against the war in Vietnam and for Canada's exit from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an imperialist alliance to not only roll back the gains of the Russian Revolution when the Soviet Union still existed, but also to intervene against democratically elected working class radical governments in Europe and around the world. So that was the foreign policy dimension of the
Tommy. So Tommy Douglas had a more I hate that term progressive, but he had a more progressive foreign policy position compared to sort of all the leaders that came after him then on the federal level.
Yeah, to put it into a context, into a continuum, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation was begun in 1932-33 during the Dirty 30s, the Great Depression. Its founding document, the Regina Manifesto, was a left social democratic declaration of the need to eradicate capitalism through public ownership and democratic control of the commanding heights of the economy. The NDP, under the impact of the Cold War and McCarthyism, retreated to the Winnipeg Declaration in 1956, which basically not only embraced the mixed economy as a virtue, but the predominant role of private ownership. But then with the rise of the civil rights movement, the early phase of modern feminism, and opposition to the war in Vietnam, By the late 60s, early 70s, the NDP was on a more radical policy line. And then in the 80s, 90s, and subsequently, it retreated from that line. So now, even though it's never been removed in terms of policy, the NDP leaders say nothing about Canada exiting the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Technically, it's still on the books as a policy, or maybe it has been sunset, as they lovingly like to refer to the disappearance of radical policy. But the NDP has been retreating for some decades. And David Lewis, to come back to your question, who succeeded Tommy Douglas as leader of the NDP in 1971, at a convention that I attended in Ottawa, the capital of the Canadian state, is best known for the expulsion of the left-wing nationalist waffle movement, the socialist left wing of the NDP, which began in 1969 and left the party in 1972 when David Lewis's son, Stephen Lewis, who was leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party, the provincial party in Ontario, basically issued an ultimatum that the waffle should disband or leave.
Like father, like son.
Yeah.
You can Dad took care of getting rid of them on the federal level, and son took care of getting rid of them on the provincial level, the local level.
Yeah, the harsh ultimatum actually originated at the provincial Ontario level, and it's true. Yeah, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So the waffle was issued that ultimatum, and then a great debate broke out inside the socialist formation in the NDP. The NDP at the time had about 80,000 members, and the waffle had about 10,000 adherents. So it was a significant phenomenon. And the majority of the waffle movement decided to leave the NDP, form an independent party, which survived only for 2 or 3 years thereafter. I was part of the Stay and Fight Caucus, which was much smaller than the waffle all told.
It's like staying in the NDP and still trying to fight it despite what they just did to the waffles.
Yeah, because many rank and file NDPers and labor activists, and, again, the NDP is a labor-based political party. It's not just a right-wing social democratic epiphenomenon. It's deeply rooted in the labor movement, which is what interests me in it. I mean, without that, I wouldn't be attached to the NDP in the same way. We wanted to stay and fight against the undemocratic exclusion, the undemocratic ultimatum issued to the waffle, and to win the working class in whole or in part to a fundamental change, anti-capitalist change, socialist transformation of society. Without the working class, there can be no socialist revolution. And so it's important to engage with working people where they are, where we are, in the NDP, in the unions, tenants' rights organizations, pensioners groups, feminists, and gay liberation organizations, and many others. So, you have to go to the mountain. The mountain will not come to you. And that's something that, unfortunately, some currents on the left refuse to acknowledge because they don't like what they see. But the problem with the NDP is the same problem as the one we see in the labor movement. Conservative leadership that is engaged in concessions bargaining and which has adapted to the power of the capitalist class with a commitment only to bread and butter issues, not able even to deliver those.
And before I ask about the leadership that came after David Lewis, what were some of the things that he championed that still made working class Canadians say, okay, we need to be part of the NDP? Because the NDP, of course, always attacks the Liberals from the left. The Liberal Party of Canada has often been the ruling party. It's a dominant force in Canadian political culture. So what were some of the things that David Lewis championed, or he was forced to champion because of the people power movement in the NDP. That still is an everlasting legacy.
Yeah. Well, the Prime Minister of Canada in 1972 was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father.
Yeah.
Trudeau in 1970 invoked the War Measures Act. The NDP under Tommy Douglas's leadership voted in the House of Commons against the War Measures Act, against the imposition of the suspension of civil liberties and the jailing of hundreds of people, particularly in Quebec. Most of them were
and actually explain very briefly what was the War Measures Act that Pierre Trudeau invoked.
The War Measures Act was first adopted by the Canadian Parliament in the days of the First World War to oppose those who didn't support the imperialist war. And it was invoked again during the Second World War, primarily against Quebec. The Mackenzie King promised that there would be no conscription for the war, but he fell in behind Great Britain and the United States, the imperialist war was seen quite differently in Quebec as compared to the rest of the country. So that's a topic that deserves everyone's attention, but I'll leave it at that. So the War Measures Act, which was invoked in 1970, was ostensibly in response to the kidnapping by Quebec nationalists of a British trade commissioner and also a Quebec provincial labor minister, a member of the provincial government. Pierre Laporte was killed by ostensibly by his kidnappers, but the Front de Libération du Québec was heavily infiltrated by the RCMP. And according to Pierre Valliere, who wrote a book on the subject, the actions that occurred in October 1970 that allowed Trudeau to justify or to try to justify his suspension of civil liberties may have been provoked by the RCMP in an effort to create a crisis that would lead to the repression and destruction of the Quebec nationalist movement. Well, it didn't work. In fact, it backfired.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Just in 1976, the Parti Québécois, a pro-independence bourgeois party, was elected the government of Quebec. And there were successive constitutional crises over Quebec's bid to seek its independence. Now, that movement still exists, although it's muted compared to those decades. So back to David Lewis.
Yeah.
The Pierre Trudeau-led Liberals were reduced to minority government status, and between 1972 and 1974. David Lewis and the NDP supported the Liberal minority government to keep the Conservatives out and to try to extract some concessions. So you asked...
Progressive Conservatives.
Yeah, the Progressive Conservatives, which is contradiction in terms, but they're very conservative, were in the opposition. They led the official opposition. The NDP supported the Liberals. And what did they get for that? They got pension indexing and the creation of a crown corporation known as Petro-Canada. These were gasoline service stations coast to coast, and a presence in the extraction and refining of one of the carbon resources of the country. Of course, a lot of it plundered from indigenous lands without permission. So that was a 2-year corridor coalition. It wasn't a formal parliamentary coalition. The NDP did not have members of the cabinet, and we're glad for that. We're opposed to workers' parties joining in government with capitalist parties. But you can say that from the outside and on the basis of negotiated conditions, Lewis was able to obtain those two things I mentioned: pension indexing and the creation of the Petro-Canada, the oil corporation.
Interesting.
But in 1974, the NDP combined with the Conservatives, the Progressive Conservatives, to pass a motion of non-confidence, and that precipitated an election, and the NDP lost half of its seats. David Lewis lost his own constituency seat, and he resigned as leader, and then came the leadership of Ed Broadbent, who was the NDP leader from 1975 to 1989.
And before we get into Ed Broadbent, I have to ask this follow-up question. Why did the NDP then under David Lewis? Why, in your opinion, do you think that they lost when? Yeah. Why do you think that they lost when they decided to abandon their truce with the Liberals and then did that turnaround with the PC?
Well, this is the danger of collaboration with any capitalist government, even if it's a corridor coalition as opposed to a participation in the cabinet of a fusion government. The minor party to the marriage, it tends to be overlooked, derogated, sidelined, absorbed, and David Lewis conducted a very interesting and progressive campaign prior to, in 1972. His slogan was "Down with the corporate welfare bums," and he critiqued the tax system, which subsidized the super rich at the expense of everyone else. But his progressive role diminished past the election. David Lewis also helped, the Liberals break a cross-country strike of railway workers, I recall. In fact, the thousands of railway workers demonstrated on Parliament Hill, and hundreds of them broke into Parliament. And David Lewis got up on a chair and told them to cool down and go home, instead of championing their cause. So he demonstrated his loyalty to the state and to the system, people were not inspired by that perspective. And the NDP probably could have gotten a lot more. And if the NDP had presented more anti-capitalist policies and anti-imperialist policies, I think it would have built a solid base on which it could build further, on which it could grow. But the failure to do that produces diminishing returns in terms of electoral politics. The larger partner gets the credit, the junior partner gets the blame, and the Liberals ostensibly moved a bit to the left. They picked up some of the NDP vote. The NDP alienated its left wing and didn't satisfy its right wing, who thought that the Liberals had changed. The leopard had changed its spots. So everyone lost in that process, and we've seen that phenomenon occur again and again, and it may even be occurring right now.
And that's a perfect segue to the man that you mentioned after David Lewis, Ed Broadbent. Tell us about his legacies, the good and the bad, on the domestic front. How is Ed Broadbent as a leader?
Well, Ed Broadbent came out of Oshawa, which is a town 45 minutes, a city 45 minutes east of Toronto, the center of the auto industry then. Not now, because General Motors has shut down a plant that employed thousands of auto workers in the last year and a half, which is a tragedy. But then it was a bulwark of NDP support, and Ed Broadbent was elected to represent Oshawa in the federal parliament. He went on to become the leader in 75 through 89. He served in that capacity, he didn't really do much more than try to put a populist patina on the NDP electoral game, and this doesn't solidify, much less enrich class consciousness. It tends to blur the lines, and in a bid to be popular and non-ideological, there's a sacrifice of the aims of the party in terms of standing up for the working class and against exploitation and oppression on all levels. Broadbent was also a hard-line Canadian federalist, and that means he stood against Quebec independence, the self-determination movement in Quebec, and wasn't that keen on the rights of Indigenous people or Acadians or others who feel alienated from the Canadian colonial state.
Interesting.
So his alliance or his affinity to Trudeau and the Liberals on a strong, Canadian federalist, anti-independence plank didn't earn the NDP seats in Quebec, didn't earn the NDP many more seats in Ontario or Western Canada, for that matter. And that was, I guess, his contribution, kind of effectless.
That's interesting because oftentimes isn't Ed Broadbent sort of seen as one of the more explicitly left-wing leaders of the NDP, because in debates he would criticize some of the first free trade agreements between Canada and the U.S., which later became NAFTA, that Brian Mulroney was a big champion of, the leader of the Progressive Conservative, who was the Prime Minister of Canada. Ed Broadbent, like you said, he would talk left, and he would talk that sort of populist left nationalism, but the way he governed himself as leader, because we always have to look at the actions, not the words, sort of the complete opposite. He was just sort of like a controlled opposition that just kind of propped up the Liberals or the PC when they were in power, right?
It's worth noting that Ed Broadbent was actually part of the Waffle movement. He was one of the signers of the Manifesto for an Independent Socialist Canada.
Exactly.
But he quit the Waffle when he saw that it was heading further left. He was a candidate when David Lewis won the leadership against Jim Laxer, who was the candidate of the Waffle movement. Broadbent ran a third or fourth, but he stuck around. And it's funny how people are portrayed. Someone looks more radical or more progressive, if you will, than subsequent leaders, only because the party and the party elite have evolved further and further and further to the right, making their peace with capitalism. So it makes, Ed Broadbent look like a leftist, and it makes Tommy Douglas look like a Marxist. But neither one of them would qualify for those monikers.
Wow, that's fascinating. and then before I start asking you then about his successor, Audrey Maclaughlin, do you think that the reason why the NDP didn't become again leaders in the federal level because too many members of the NDP and the electorate saw how Ed Broadbent actually conducted himself?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that diminishing expectations was the phenomenon. A lower and lower horizon of possibility as unions accepted that if we can get a small wage increase, we're really not going to talk about the quality of work life or anything much beyond that. The system has its problems. Maybe we can help in some way by being moderate and serving our members, even if we're not helping to improve things for working people in the society as a whole. And of course, that doesn't generate a lot of warm and fuzzy feelings by workers who are not unionized towards unions, led by bureaucrats earning six-figure salaries. So that is a problem, and we're reaping the whirlwind of that now.
And let's talk about Audrey Maclaughlin. What were some of her good legacies and bad legacies? And she became leader of the NDP during the 1990s, right?
Well, in 1989.
Okay.
She ran for the leadership at a convention that was held in Winnipeg, which I can recall I attended. She ran against the British Columbia NDP Premier Dave Barrett. Audrey Maclaughlin was a member of Parliament for Yukon, which is one of three territories of the Canadian state in the northernmost part of Canada. She won that, posing as a feminist. I remember we supported, oh God, what was his name? Stephen Langdon, who called for a general strike to defeat the goods and services tax. This was the first goods and services tax imposed at the federal level. Of course, the government said it was temporary, but when did you ever see a tax disappear?
And if you want to explain briefly, the goods and services tax, is that very much a regressive tax, which mostly the working class and the poor have to pay, right?
That's right. I mean, everyone who purchases goods pays the tax, but it weighs more heavily because if you have a lower income, it's a bigger chunk of your income going to pay the federal tax. And we denounced it as regressive, which it is by all accounts. And Socialist Action members in the Ontario Federation of Labor led a fight to win the OFL, the Ontario Federation of Labor, one of the biggest provincial labor central, to the idea of a general strike to defeat the GST. And Stephen Langdon, who was the NDP member for a constituency in Windsor, which is in the southwest corner, also an auto center, in the southwest corner of southern Ontario. So he carried that forward under some pressure, or in alliance with us, if you want to say. But he didn't succeed in winning the leadership at the convention in Winnipeg. Audrey Maclaughlin did, the MP for Yukon. Dave Barrett, who was a candidate, was defeated by Maclaughlin, and he championed Western alienation and a very strongly anti-Quebec policy stance.
Oh, eek, not good.
Not good. In fact, the NDP's only member of Parliament elected in Quebec, in one of the Montreal constituencies, a fellow by the name of Phil Edmonston, who's sort of like the the guy who wrote the book about the auto, and Ralph Nader. He was sort of the Canadian Ralph Nader.
Yeah.
He said that he would resign his seat or quit the NDP if Barrett won and continued to lambaste Quebec and its democratic national aspirations. So Maclaughlin ran on a more traditional approach, and she became the first woman to lead a major federal political party in Canada. But she didn't succeed in expanding NDP support in Quebec. In fact, the NDP wing in Quebec adopted a sovereigntist platform, and it was shown the door by Maclaughlin and the federal leadership. Yeah. So they pushed them out. And it's interesting, we can trace from that rupture the NDP becoming another party which became what is today known as Quebec Solidaire, which has 10 members in the National Assembly in Quebec. And it's a left social democratic and sovereigntist party in Quebec today. So that's the genesis of that. You know, everything is connected.
And just in case people don't know what we mean when we say sovereignist, but yeah, that's basically, believing that Quebec, should be an independent country.
That's right. That's right. So Maclaughlin and the NDP were routed in the 1993 election, and the party was left with only 9 seats. That's in a parliament of close to 300 seats. The NDP under Maclaughlin was reduced to 9, and that was 3 seats short of official party status. So there was no money for staff and no right to ask a question in question period directly to the government. It was like you're just an independent member of parliament and sit in the back row.
Was it safe to say that that was one of the NDP's probably worst electoral defeats since its inception in the 1960s? Yeah. Then,
without a doubt, but the setback was not only due to the blasé performance of Maclaughlin and her lack of radical credentials. The NDP federally lost a great amount of support, particularly in Ontario, as a result of the Bob Rae NDP provincial government that won and held government in Ontario for a number of years. Okay. Bob Rae, who's now a Liberal. In fact, he's now the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. He's held many different posts in the bourgeois state. He was even interim leader of the Liberal Party. This guy skates all over the ice, through the penalty box and into the stands. He's quite a rotten, unprincipled character. But he imposed the social contract, which took over $1 billion out of the pockets of Ontario public service workers when he was Premier of Ontario, leading an NDP Ontario government. He said that the government had debts to pay, and the best way to do it would be to freeze wages. He also privatized some roads and some properties of the Ontario government. He was roundly hated by the labor movement and by NDP voters. So that didn't help and contributed to the rout of the federal NDP in 1993. In 1995, Maclaughlin was succeeded by Alexa McDonough. Alexa was the former leader of.
But before we get to Alexa, so is it safe to say that Audrey Maclaughlin, even if she didn't explicitly support the leadership of Bob Rae, but she was how do you say, she was collateral damage when the electorate and the NDP voters decided not to vote for her in droves?
Yeah, I mean, collateral damage, but that's a little too kind. I think she refrained from criticizing a government that was acting against the interests of working people in a particularly gross way, imposing a wage freeze on workers by an ostensibly pro-worker government. That's really beyond the pale. It's like crossing a picket line. So you could use stronger words than collateral damage, but fair enough.
But also, as you mentioned, the fact that she wasn't so much of a flaming left-winger and was another one of these, moderate leaders that the NDP always thinks is the best, is the best way to go. That was probably another reason why in the 1990s she wasn't given, Prime Minister of Canada, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I said a few moments ago, the NDP was declining from, its radical, well, its more progressive persona of the late 60s, early 70s. And Maclaughlin continued that sad trend towards right-wing social democratic policies. And it was increased by Alexa McDonough to follow her.
And so talk to us then about Alexa. So talk to us about Alexa McDonough. How do you assess her time as party leader?
Well, on her advent to the leadership, she did take the NDP through lead the NDP through a federal election campaign in which the party picked up 8 seats in Atlantic Canada, but it didn't make much headway elsewhere. And she did champion the issue of improving access to employment insurance benefits. But basically, she is seen as moving the party towards what the media likes to, bless their pointy little heads, refer to as the center of the political spectrum. And McDonough is identified with the third way of British Prime Minister Tony Blair, that class struggle is just a fantasy. It's no longer a reality, and that we have to help the system solve its problems. We're neither for capitalism nor for socialism. There's a third way, which is unmistakably the rule of the giant corporations and banks. Call that what you will. I call it corporate capitalism.
Exactly.
And in fact, the policy direction under Alexa McDonough was so alienating that the leader of the Canadian Auto Workers Union, which is now called Unifor, because it merged with the Paper Workers Union, Communication and Paper Workers. But back in the day, the leader of the Auto Workers Union, Buzz Hargrove, called for McDonough's resignation. And then that moved the Auto Workers Union into increasing opposition to the NDP leadership, wanting a stronger, more combative pro-worker stance. You can put it that way. I wouldn't say full-blown socialism on the part of that leadership of the segment of the labor movement. But there was an alienation factor that was palpable. That led to the estrangement of the Auto Workers Union, and eventually Buzz Hargrove and the auto workers would adopt what is now known as strategic voting. And strategic voting entails voting for the party that you think has the best chance of winning the seat locally against the conservative government of Stephen Harper or his predecessors or successors, which is seen as the great threat. In some ways, in the United States today, you'll see socialists and some labor activists saying, well, we got to hold our nose and vote for Biden because Trump is a fascist. Yeah. Well, Trump is too stupid to be a fascist. He's just a very eccentric, all over the map, moron.
Thank you for saying that, because I completely agree with that assessment of pumpkin heads.
But this kind of lesser evilism was denounced by the great American socialist and railway union leader Eugene V. Debs. And he said 100 years ago, it's better to fight for what you want and not get it than to fight for what you don't want and get it. So, workers need a third option, a Labour Party in the United States, and the idea of tactical voting in Canada to prefer Liberals over NDP candidates in order to stop the Conservatives, the Tories, is completely wrong-headed. It simply weakens the base of the working class politically and encourages the corporate elite to fight more boldly for their anti-worker policies. It really takes us out of the game, or it diminishes our role in the game. And that's a crime against the working class.
So Alexa McDonough's legacy is one of you would think after Audrey Maclaughlin's epic defeat, it sounds very much like a massacre what happened under her leadership. Alexa McDonough, instead of again going back to what the NDP should be, which should be a socialist alternative to the two rival oligarchs of the liberals, the progressive conservatives, and the Tea Party movement at the time, which was the Reform Party. Alexa McDonough still thought to let's embrace the third way, in which you're no longer even on paper a socialist party, and that. So the reaction of the people power movements, of the union movement, is okay. We can no longer even vote for the NDP. We just basically have to, vote for a liberal here, vote for an ostensibly socialist NDP over here. But of course, that got both the party and the union movements, the people power movements, nowhere, because all they got was the golden years of the liberals in power under Chrétien, and we know how that was. Chrétien was the he was. I think it's safe to say he was the Bill Clinton, Tony Blair of Canada, right?
Right, and up to his eyeballs in corruption. The sponsorship scandal, revealed by the Gomery Commission, and much more. He used to brag. He even held up a golf ball and said, "I got this as a gift from the President of the United States, and that's all I got. But he got a lot more." And he used federal money to grease the wheels of his own party machine in Quebec and the rest of Canada. So yeah, that's what we got. Diminishing returns. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Um, yeah,
and before we get into the leader that took over Alexa,
well, there's something that precedes that I wanted to mention.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, the decline in the fortunes of the NDP, which I think were to a large extent self-inflicted, led to a convention in Winnipeg in November 2001, which was supposed to be a convention where the party would engage in a renewal process. Even the establishment had to admit that things were pretty screwed up and a rethink was necessary, but it was only, it was a mile wide and an inch deep. It was very superficial. And the alterations made to party structures, which was basically to make them more inclusive. So not only position for women leader on the federal executive, but other caucuses and interest groups were recognized and allowed to have seats on party structures. But this did not represent policy change. The party elite did their best to keep radical policies even from coming to the floor for debate. And when they did, they would stack the mics or they would orchestrate the debate so that only one or two voices were heard from the left. And that was
under Alexa McDonough's leadership.
And it's Alexa McDonough, by the way.
Oh,
you can drop the last syllable.
Oh, okay.
So there was a convention in Winnipeg to reaffirm the commitment to the left, but it was very superficial. So McDonough announced her resignation as party leader, giving family reasons as the cause for her resignation. But she held on until she was succeeded. But I wanted to say as well, at that Winnipeg convention, where the so-called renewal process was engineered and launched, the Socialist Caucus ran a candidate on the floor of the convention against Alexa McDonough for the leadership. His name was Marcel Hatch. He was a gay activist, a member of Socialist Action, and he got like 200 or 300 votes against her 750 votes. And he wasn't a member of parliament. He was not a known commodity. He ran. And there were stirrings in the party. There was the formation of something called the New Party Initiative, NPI, led by some prominent authors and activists. And it garnered some support, which showed that there was concern about the decline of the NDP and its ever shift politically to the right. So Maclaughlin, it wasn't all smiles and chuckles. She did face opposition from the left, and then shortly after that, they decided we're not going to have leadership elections at convention anymore. That's too risky. Someone from the Marxist wing of the party might actually succeed. So they said we'll be more democratic. It'll be one member, one vote, and in order to run, you have to deposit thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Hold on, let me just put on phone here. There we go. Not just signatures, but you had to post money, big money, in order to be a candidate, and you had to have signatures in the hundreds from every major region of the country. That did not make it easy for ordinary workers to run for the leadership of their party.
Obviously, yeah.
Much more difficult. But there was a one member, one vote election of leader that was held and completed in January 2003. And the new leader was Jack Layton, who was a city councillor in Toronto, he was a leader of the Federation of Municipalities across the country. He had some roots in Quebec and spoke a passable French, I'm told. And unfortunately, his leadership was cut short because he had cancer and he died in office. Now
Jack Layton, now Jack Layton, and that's perfect segue because I want to talk to you then about the legacy of Jack Layton. Now, a lot of times, people not from Canada who once upon a time I was very naive about Canadian politics, and I always thought that the NDP was always kind of like the Ralph Naders of Canada. But now, and oftentimes, when people talk about Jack Layton, you'll often hear people who were never part of the NDP and would never vote for the NDP saying, "Oh, that Jack Layton guy, I'm not an NDPer, but that Jack Layton, he was a great leader of the NDP." And oftentimes, Jack Layton is often, lionized. Even in traditional corporate media of Canada and in the CBC as the best leader that the NDP never had. But when reading about Jack Layton on the World Socialist website, it's a pretty grim. They depict his leadership as a very grim one. So from there, talk to us about.
I knew
Jack Layton,
I knew Jack. I knew Jack personally, and he was a very warm and engaging person. He would talk to you. He would listen to what you say, but he would do what he intended to do all along. He was not a radical. He was not a left-winger in terms of the debates in the NDP. And they say don't speak ill of the dead, but we're engaged in historiography where we're accounting for the objective political role of all of these leaders, and quite a few of the ones we've discussed today are departed. So it's unavoidable to say that Jack put a progressive patina on his leadership and on the NDP, but it was not inclusive. It was highly centralist. He developed to a much greater degree the party's reliance on opinion polls in order to determine what policies it would campaign. He did not encourage the voices of the left in party debate, much less on the ruling bodies of the party. The party brass, which he headed, continued to run iron cast slates of candidates for all the top positions in the federal council, at party federal conventions.
Oh, wow.
It was pretty unforgiving. And let's take Afghanistan as an example. The NDP today is seen as the party that agitated for Canada's removal of troops from the ill-fated imperialist mission in Afghanistan. The truth is, Layton and the NDP tops resisted the anti-war movement's call for Canadian troops out of Afghanistan, much less our demand that Canada leave NATO. It was only as a result of a fight that was led by the Socialist Caucus in alliance with other anti-war groups at an NDP federal convention in Quebec in 2006 that we got the party to adopt a resolution, a policy that says Canada out of Afghanistan. And it was even months after that before Jack would speak out in favor of that policy that was adopted and that everyone could see because the convention was televised. So he became known as Taliban Jack, quite unfairly, because
called Taliban Jack just because he reluctantly, emphasis on the word reluctantly, said, okay, we need to get out of Afghanistan.
And carry out the policies democratically adopted by the party delegates at a party convention.
Wow.
So, we in the Socialist Caucus are proud to have led that struggle. We didn't accomplish it by ourselves, but as I say, in alliance with the anti-war movement and many other organizations who are on the streets. And I remember when I led off the debate on the party convention floor, someone said, well, we should study the issue. We need to know what the Canadian people have to say about this. And my reply to a standing ovation is, we know what the Canadian people have to say about this. They're in the streets fighting this dirty war. And the House came down. Our resolution carried overwhelmingly. And it shows that it's important to be in a mass labor party because that's where real politics involving hundreds of thousands and millions of people takes place. That's why it's important that the Canadian left come to terms with that fact. Because if you're not fighting the right wing in the NDP, you're not fighting the right wing in the unions or in the other popular movements, And you're not going to be able to change society unless you win those fights by engaging in them where it really matters.
What were some of Jack's uh, uh, what were some of his positive legacies? Because if he had any that that you can speak of, because I was quite shocked again because of the propaganda that comes out about Jack Layton, about how again he followed this this trend of the NDP leadership, which was yes, they would campaign for a little bit of higher taxes on the rich and more spending on affordable education and healthcare and so forth. But and the criticism I often say of the NDP is that they're very much a diet liberal party. But what were some of Jack's what were some of Jack Layton's positive legacies, if any, that you assess of his leadership?
Well, the Liberals were in a minority government situation again, and the NDP had a decisive role to play. So the Liberal leader and the Prime Minister was Paul Martin, again coming from Windsor, the auto centre in the southwest corner of Ontario. And Paul Martin made a habit of promising everything to everybody and delivering almost none of it. One of his famous
typical liberal.
Yeah, and Justin Trudeau is doing exactly that right now. But we'll come to that hopefully soon, because we're already an hour and 10 minutes into this interview, and I hope people watching it find it as fascinating as you do.
Oh, they will. Remember, Canadians' second largest audience.
Okay. So, the hold on, let me do that. Given the minority government situation, the NDP was able to extract some concessions in terms of fighting healthcare privatization, in terms of promises to meet Canada's obligations in accordance with the Kyoto Protocol, on environmental, curbing pollution and reliance on carbon fuel, and the promise of electoral reform. But again, the electoral reform in any significant way didn't happen. I mean, university students were allowed to vote where they were either living or where they were studying. But apart from really tiny changes like that, proportional representation, which was, a very popular position and still is, was not implemented. Justin Trudeau promised that in the election a year ago, and he abandoned it within weeks of his formation of a government. So the NDP got amendments from Paul Martin's government to the federal budget, preempting about $4.5 billion in corporate tax cuts, and to put that money towards funding social, educational, and environmental programs instead. To what degree those things were funded as they should have been, I don't have the details in front of me, but suffice it to say that the pandemic today is demonstrating how wide the cracks are in Canadian society. As the poor are poorer, they're just hanging on with the benefits that federal government is reluctantly providing. The Tories would cut those. The actions of the Paul Martin government didn't meet the promise of providing public quality childcare coast to coast, and some of the other issues and improvements that were promised that I just mentioned.
So Layton again talked sometimes a good game of left policies, but as you mentioned, didn't really do that much to really improve the lives of working Canadians. Yeah, and which then leads us to Thomas Mulcair and how do you assess him and Jagmeet Singh?
And to be fair to Jack Layton, he was popular because he campaigned while leaning on a cane, suffering from cancer. He died in the position of federal leader and as a member of parliament. He was idolized because he campaigned despite his illness. And he did show a lot of personal courage. There's no doubt about that. But he centralized the party to such a degree that it basically snuffed out any capacity for the organized left to be heard, to be readily heard in the party's decision-making fora. And that's not good. You could say unforgivable. Whoever did it. So that was the legacy of a highly centralized leadership that relied on opinion polls, that curtails the rights of the left, and for free debate in party chambers.
And that's a perfect segue to Thomas Mulcair, who, I'm not going to say my opinions about Thomas Mulcair. Speak to us about Thomas Mulcair, because it sounds to me as if Jack Layton's legacy on just even how the party itself was structured, the NDP, that basically almost paved the way for Thomas Mulcair, one of the most unpopular leaders of the NDP, right?
Yeah. So let's just record the fact that in 2011, the federal election that year, the NDP won a record 103 seats. And that is credited to Jack Layton, his ability to speak, a passable French in the media debates, his genteel and pleasant personality, his genuine interest in listening to what people have to say, even if he wasn't going to act accordingly. He was the leader of the official opposition, but when he died in office, I'm trying to remember her name, Turmel. Madame Turmel was a temporary leader, and then there was a leadership vote, and Tom Mulcair was elected. Now, Tom Mulcair had been a member of the Quebec Liberal government.
Yeah, I think I got her name here on my notes. Nicole Turmel, right?
That's right, Nicole Turmel. Thanks very much for that.
No problem.
And she was a leader of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, coming from the Quebec side of it. And she didn't really leave a legacy that is worth mentioning. She was interim and accepted that, and by taking on that role, she agreed that she wouldn't run for leader. That was a precondition. The Bloc Québécois support, the Bloc Québécois is the federal wing or the federal sister party of the Parti Québécois, which is a bourgeois nationalist party. Its vote collapsed in Quebec, so that helped the NDP to pick up a great many seats. In fact, 59 of the 74 seats in Quebec went to the NDP, even though the NDP had hitherto elected no more than one or two members in Quebec in its entire history. So there was disenchantment with the federal government and an unwillingness to go with the Tories or the Liberals or the Bloc, and so the NDP was the beneficiary of that, but it couldn't hold on to those seats for more than one term in government. Now, why did the NDP support drop precipitously, not only in Quebec, but all across Canada, from 103 seats to down to I don't remember exactly, 34 seats nationally? Well, Tom Mulcair, who was, as I said, a former Liberal cabinet minister in Quebec and who jumped to the NDP, he was wooed by Jack Layton, made the Quebec lieutenant of the party, was smart by half. He decided that, well, he's the leader of the official opposition, poised to form government, better play to the middle of the political spectrum. He campaigned in favor of a balanced budget. And a balanced budget in a situation when social services already are underfunded and corporate taxes are way too low means taxing who? Working people. The Liberal Party, under a very cynical and energetic and youthful Justin Trudeau, campaigned for deficit budget. They said, we have to support Canadians. We'll find a way to pay it later. He didn't say we'll make the corporate elite pay, but he said, we'll find a way to pay it later. And the Liberals campaigned disingenuously to the left of the NDP.
Yeah.
Right? So Mulcair flamed out, and the Liberals formed a majority government. And there was a convention of the NDP in Edmonton, which I remember quite clearly as well. And there was a vote on whether to have a confidence in the leader or to have a leadership renewal process. Well, the pundits said, if Mulcair he's not going to get 80%. Maybe if he gets 70, 60%, even 59%, that would be good enough. Well, when the vote was tallied among the 1,300 delegates on the floor at the Edmonton Convention Center, Mulcair lost. He didn't even get 48%. 52% demanded a leadership review. So he resigned effective on his replacement, and that led to Jagmeet Singh. But
before we get into Jagmeet Singh, because now the reason why NDP members and it's funny because the membership of the NDP actually is pretty revolutionary socialists. Yes, there are people who are moderate socialists or social democrats, whatever you want to call them, but by and large, the NDP membership at large is very much, is very much explicitly socialist. Some like yourselves are even Marxists. But did that membership?
I wouldn't go that far. I would say most NDPers identify with the socialist goal, but I wouldn't say they're radical socialists.
Okay.
Not at all. That would be an unfair and misleading exaggeration.
Okay, fair enough.
But the NDP is rooted in the socialist movement in this country, going back to World War I and the Winnipeg General Strike and the protest movements by farmers and workers in the Great Depression and the surge in union organizing following World War II, and again the anti-war and labor movements of the 60s and 70s. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that the average NDP voter.
So that said, did that membership only vote for Thomas Mulcair the first time around because Jack Layton said, "Hey, he's my second in command"? So therefore, because Jack Layton was popular, rightly or wrongly, but because of Jack Layton's popularity and the fact that he did produce what was called the Orange Wave, people thought, okay, let's give Thomas Mulcair a shot. But when they saw how he conducted himself, the fact that you have a guy who's leader of the NDP, but he's praising Margaret Thatcher, that when the general election came, people just could not bring themselves to vote for him, and then engaged in what you criticized, this, the ridiculous tactical voting, the tactical voting, which gives the Liberals, their political comeback.
Right, and then you add to that the Liberals campaigned in the election to the left of the NDP against a balanced budget policy. So that really killed it for the NDP, and Tom Mulcair he lost the leadership review vote at the NDP policy convention in Edmonton, Alberta, on April 10th, 2016. That was also the convention where the LEAP manifesto was presented. Yeah. And I want to say a word about this. The LEAP manifesto called for an eco-socialist Canada. It said the NDP should take the lead in phasing out the old carbon-based energy industries and the old energy system writ large, and replace it with sustainable energy, and even provided a conceptual space for more public ownership to move in that direction, as well as to valorize healthcare, the caring for seniors and people who have special physical and mental challenges, Indigenous, satisfying the rights, upholding the rights.
Oh yeah, it's very explicitly pro-Indigenous rights and anti-colonial.
That's right. So the LEAP manifesto was a big factor at that convention, as well as the work that we did in terms of the Socialist Caucus on the floor, agitating for leftist policies. We supported the LEAP manifesto as well, and the leadership, adapted to the situation by saying, well, we need to study this. So let's have a period of discussion across the party, and we'll foster meetings that members can attend in every electoral district, or at least regionally. Well, guess, in terms of 320 constituencies, guess how many had discussions on the LEAP manifesto? Go ahead.
Several. I'm going to say several.
You're a diplomat. Well, there were several, but the number was several lower than 10.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Explain so explain why that is.
Well, because the party leadership that promised to have a deep and thoroughgoing policy discussion on the proposals of the LEAP manifesto apparently never intended to do it. It was just a way to escape in one piece from a convention that voted for leadership review to get rid of, the balanced budget Tom Mulcair. So it was, I guess it would be a bit harsh to say they knowingly lied to the membership. I'll let people draw their own conclusions about that. But they did not hold the forums on the LEAP manifesto and its proposals, even if only to reject them, but at least to discuss them. That did not occur. And this was another layer of cynicism that was put upon the membership by an indifferent and obdurate party leadership. And by leadership, I don't just mean, the members of parliament at the top of the pyramid, but the whole bureaucratic apparatus. It did not.
Who were also hostile to the LEAP manifesto because it talked about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and the Alberta NDP, led by the very right-wing Rachel Notley, was very much hostile to the LEAP manifesto.
Yeah. She denounced the LEAP manifesto. In fact, she went on television in Alberta on the second last day of the party convention to denounce it. And they poured all the weight they could onto the scales to isolate the LEAP manifesto, but they couldn't defeat it. The president of the Alberta Federation of Labor took the microphone on the floor of the convention and denounced it. But still, the convention was overwhelmingly favorable to it, and the only way they could escape what for them was a crisis of credibility was to say, we will have a discussion all across the country on this topic, and we'll come back in a year or two, and then we'll decide. Well, there was no discussion, and there was no return to it a year or two later. It just, the LEAP folks just went on and campaigned as an independent non-governmental organization, and they continue to do that work today. But it intensified the sense of powerlessness in the party ranks and the disaffection with this kind of capitalist way of doing politics.
And that's a perfect segue then into the last and current leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. But before talking to us about how you assess his leadership and and the way he conducts politics, talk to us about the leadership race after Tom Mulcair was rightly given the boots, and talk to us about the interesting insurgent candidates of Nikki Ashton before talking to us about how you assess Jagmeet Singh, the current leader of the NDP.
Well, there were a number of candidates for party leader, and Nikki Ashton is the one that we critically supported. We, in the Socialist Caucus, attempted to persuade Sid Ryan, the former president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, and a 5-time NDP candidate provincially and federally, to seek the leadership. We were working closely with him. We on our website, people can see the policy framework that we developed. It was quite detailed, quite extensive. Alas, Sid decided not to run. He doesn't speak French. He thought that would be a deadly lack in terms of being able to campaign. We suggested there could be like a partner who would be the spokesperson in Quebec, much the way Tom Mulcair was for the federal party once upon a time. But he opted out. So we critically supported Nikki. She called for a more progressive foreign policy so that Canada would not be part of the Lima group that's trying to overthrow the democratically elected government of Venezuela, for example.
And let me interject. Sorry to interrupt. Is it safe to say that compared to all previous leaders, if she had gotten the leadership, she would have had probably the most anti-imperialist platform that the NDP ever had compared to all the previous leaders before, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Nikki's not a Marxist, but she is a left social democrat. Her father was a one-time leader of the Manitoba NDP, and he ran a pretty, right-wing social democratic provincial administration. But I'm not going to visit the sins of the father on the daughter. She was, in her own right, a feminist, multilingual, very strong on Aboriginal rights, favored public ownership in a very limited way, in a very couple of specific areas, including a railroad that goes to Churchill, Manitoba from Winnipeg, which broke down under private ownership, leaving a lot of people in Churchill without the things that they transported by rail. So she came third, I believe.
Yeah, she did. But she ran twice for the leadership, didn't she? Or
yeah, one time before, and we supported her then too. She only got 5 or 6% of the vote. It was rather pathetic, kind of weak. She did better in the second run. Charlie Angus was another candidate. He lives in Northern Ontario. He talks a lot about Indigenous rights, but he's, a middle of the road social democrat, let's say. And Jagmeet Singh, and there was another candidate actually from Quebec.
Guy Caron who campaigned for universal basic income.
Yeah, basically tax reform and UBI. He was kind of like a one-note orchestra. And then there was Jagmeet Singh. And Jagmeet, notably, first person, visible minority group to lead a major Canadian federal political party on an ongoing basis when he was elected leader on October 1st, 2017.
Yeah.
But he was the most right-wing, the most conservative of all the candidates that ran for leader to replace Tom Mulcair. And his position, he took Layton's slogan, love and courage, and carried it to a ridiculous height. He said, I'm all about love. I'm all about, let's help our neighbor.
Yeah. I'm in it for you. That's what he often says, right?
Yeah. And, I'm sure he believes that on a certain level, but it's very vague. It doesn't tell you how to contend with the overwhelming power of the 1%, or actually the 0.01%, who control, Canadian industry and resources, who use the state as a weapon against small business, against working people, against Indigenous people, against all those who suffer discrimination in the many walks of life. So that's highly problematic. His vagary, it takes you so far, only so far. The big smile, the fact that he is proud to wear his turban, I think that's terrific. But he doesn't show that he's a deep thinker. I mean, maybe he's the most brilliant person in the NDP orchestra, but it's not obvious. And his policies are lacking in courage. There's a group in the NDP called Courage, which is also lacking in courage because they don't run candidates to replace the right-wingers in the NDP. But Jagmeet, although he bandies the Jack Layton slogans about love and courage, does not present a working class program, a socialist program, a public ownership and workers' control program, a tax big business program, a Green New Deal based on public ownership, make the plunderers, the giant oil and gas corporations, give back what they stole to Indigenous people, and so that Canada has a green, sustainable energy future. This is all missing, all missing. It's what eco-socialists like us advocate, and
so safe to say that he's
not there.
So safe to say that he's a diet that at best that at best he's almost like a diet liberal then.
Yeah. A left liberal or a right-wing social democrat. I mean, the lines are fuzzy between them. So I'm not going to, pin them down to one or the other, but they're both undesirable. It's basically third way Tony Blair type politics. That doesn't work in a world that's increasingly polarized, facing authoritarianism, despots who would rob women of the right to abortion in Poland, and right-wing governments in Hungary and in Turkey, repressive regimes in Brazil, crazy, anti-health governments in the United States and other places. And you can say in Canada as well. There's a lot of work to be done, and we need, class struggle socialist leadership to take on the challenges of the present day, and that means we have to advance those ideas. It won't occur through some magical osmosis process. We have to articulate openly and clearly that we're for public ownership, we're for a democratically controlled economy. It's not an ideological fixation. It's a necessity in terms of the environmental crisis that we are now experiencing. The forest sector in the west of North America is on fire. Sea levels are rising. Species are going extinct. Food is not adequate to meet the needs of the population on all the continents. We really need to do something, and we need to do it fast. We have just a few years.
Exactly, but that said, and I guess my last two questions would be this. Before we talk about whether the NDP, or why you think the NDP. Anyways, before I get into that question,
okay,
but then why then, with all that being said, and with an NDP membership, which is very much, that wants socialist reforms and definitely wants to, push back against the 1%. Why then did Jagmeet Singh become leader as opposed to Nikki Ashton?
Well, when you have a one-member, one-vote election of leader, on the surface, it seems very democratic. But the members don't meet to discuss this. They are reduced to being observers of a television show. They read about it in the newspapers. In the newspapers, even the liberal Toronto Star, much less the Globe and Mail or the National Post or the Sun or the chain of Sun publications, Post publications, which are reactionary.
Yeah.
They promote and they report on the candidates that they favor, and they put in a dark light, in a critical perspective, the candidates that they disfavor. Plus, the party makes it very difficult for left-wingers to run, because you have to pony up tens of thousands of dollars, and you have to be able to do a lot of traveling, which the mass media is going to ignore most of your meetings. So we favor the election of the leader at a delegated convention, encouraging the leadership candidates to interact with the members at the base, and then those members elect delegates on the basis of their policy affinity to one or another of the candidates. They can change their minds. They're not held to a pledge to vote a certain way at the convention. And if there's more than two candidates, they're going to have to change. They're going to have to vote for others. We're not in favor of a ranked ballot where people sit in isolation at home, having read the editorials of the Toronto Star and being guided to support the candidate that would be good for Canada. Is it corporate Canada or is it working class Canada? There's more than one Canada. There's more than one Canada in terms of national oppression too.
Yeah, exactly.
There's the people of color who suffer police violence and whose kids are getting the poor quality of education and lack of proper health care and even lack of, protective equipment in the nursing homes and other places where people of color are often frequently on the front line, providing basic essential services in the retail shops and in the healthcare system and the school system and so on and so forth. So this one person, one vote electoral system that the NDP adopted is not democratic. And that's why you have limited options that are curtailed by a number of factors that I just mentioned, and it produces a poor result. So we argue as socialists, if you want to have a better result, we need to build our strength in the streets. Even in pandemic times, we saw the biggest mass movement against racism probably in the history of the world. In the United States, it is estimated that there were some 25 million people who took to the streets after George Floyd was murdered by a cop in Minneapolis. And there have been many more police murders since then in Canada, of Indigenous people and people of color generally, as well as in the United States and in Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America. So, we can do a lot better. And we say, as socialists, we need to build a revolutionary socialist organization. We need to be active in the labor movement and in the labor-based NDP and in other social protest movements to advance a workers' agenda. There's no substitute for that. There's no shortcut. Putting on a black hood and smashing some store windows or lighting a police cruiser on fire is not a substitute for the action that's needed to convince people that there is a better alternative and that we can bring it about through our action in the streets, in our masses, on the picket lines, in conferences, and in movements to fight for tenants' rights, to fight for transportation that's adequate, to fight for a healthy and ecological society.
Then that's a perfect segue then to my last question, and thanks for explaining how why even though Nikki Ashton was was very much a great socialist reformist leader, why she didn't get even second place but got third place, because the stacks are so decked against the NDP membership, as well as the propaganda system, which I know our comrade Eve Engler has talked about. But then all that said, actually, let me read then my last question.
Did you save the best for last?
Exactly. So then, all that said, why do you feel then that the NDP, despite its history of being a controlled opposition left party rather than and its history of supporting imperialism, and oftentimes critics of the NDP from the left, like the Socialist Equality Group or the Communist Party of Canada and others, will say that the NDP is just a tool to co-opt the left to prop up the Liberals, which is a rival oligarch party. And also, we've talked, you've told us about how the NDP has often, been hostile towards, popular social movements like the Waffle, being hostile towards the eco-socialist, anti-colonial Leap Manifesto. And of course, we've seen the NDP, in power in BC and other places, oppress the Wet'suwet'en, the land water protectors.
True.
So all that being said, why do you feel that that the left movements, the people power movement, should still try to take over the NDP and make that sort of the vehicle for okay, maybe not revolutionary socialism, but for socialist policies and for pro people power policies, as opposed to, say, joining the Socialist Equality Group or even the Green Party, in which Dimitri Lascaris, who almost got into power in the Green Party, although second place consistently through their ranked choice voting.
Well, first of all, the Green Party is a capitalist party, and It did poorly in the election in British Columbia that just took place yesterday. The NDP is forming a majority government in the third largest province by population in the Canadian Federation. So that's maybe that's news to people watching this interview. We had a very encouraging electoral result. The NDP went from a minority government to majority government, picking up 14 seats.
In British Columbia.
In British Columbia, provincial election that occurred yesterday. There are more ballots to be counted, but most of observers are confident that the NDP has attained majority government status, and now there's no excuse for the NDP not raising the minimum wage, not providing energy alternatives, not dealing with the housing crisis, not dealing with the transportation congestion issue. There's just no excuse. They don't rely on the capitalist Green Party to prop up a minority government in British Columbia, which they did for the last 3 years. But that really doesn't address the question at the heart of it. Let me answer that question with a question.
Okay.
You know, the leaders of the labor movement, the leaders of the Canadian Labour Congress, of the major affiliates of the CLC in all the provinces and territories, the leaders of Unifor, CUPE, the National NUPCI, National Union of Provincial Government Employees, like OPSU in Ontario, or AUCE in Alberta, or BCGEU in British Columbia. All of these leaders, the Service Employees Union, the Teamsters, all of these leaders have exactly the same characteristics as the NDP leadership. Yeah. In fact, some of them are exactly the same people who serve not only as heads of those unions and labor federations and labor councils, but they're also on the federal executive of the NDP. It's exactly the same problem. So my question is, why should people who are disenchanted with the NDP leadership not also quit, turn their backs upon, have nothing further to do with the unions? Because the problem is the same. And so it requires the degree of political maturity that brings one swiftly to the conclusion that the only way to deal with this problem of class collaborationist, reformist or sub-reformist leadership is to fight in the organizations of the working class for socialist policies, and not to confine activity to that realm, but also to be active in the streets, demanding the police be disarmed, defunded, and disbanded, to demand solutions to problems around transportation and the environment and housing and all of the rest of it, to be part of the grassroots movement. But the working class needs a political solution. It needs a workers' government to implement the policies that will begin to transform our society from the bottom up, not from the top down. And that in order to do that, it needs a party. The socialist left in Canada, if you put it all together in one organization, which wouldn't last 5 minutes because it would explode due to the internal contradictions, political disagreements. But even if you compressed it into one organization, it wouldn't even equal the membership of the NDP in the smallest province of Canada. Okay. So it's important to fight where it matters. The Socialist Caucus has a high profile because it is the organized left, the organized radical left in the New Democratic Party. So whenever there's a party convention, a leadership race, a campaign, the media ask us for a comment. Like, what do you think about this? Do they ask all of the other components of the left? I'm not going to talk about the specific organizations you mentioned. Some of them have a lot of baggage. They're Stalinists. They've supported totalitarian regimes. They are against the rights of LGBTQI people. They have supported liberals instead of class independence. They violated Eugene Debs' rule. It's better to fight for what you want and not get it than fight for what you don't want and get stuck with it. And some of the groups, one of them that you mentioned, is simply a cult. It's a sect that refuses to recognize that the NDP is a working class party. Yes, it's a.
I'm going to assume you're talking about the SCP, the Socialist Equality Party, which produces the world's socialist websites and.
Yeah, this This is a group that believes that the assassination of Trotsky was engineered by the American Socialist Workers' Party in league with the GPU, the Stalinist police, in 1940. I mean, it's just an insane organization which has no boots on the ground and that does not even recognize that the NDP is a workers' party. It characterizes it in the same breath and in the same fashion as the Liberals, the Conservatives, the People's Party of Canada, all of the capitalist parties. We don't just reject that for ideological reasons. It's just manifestly absurd. The NDP, if you go to an NDP convention, first thing you see are all the placards on the tables and chairs signifying the union delegations that are present. The problem is these union delegations may advocate socialist policies, they may not. And often the delegations reflect the leadership of the unions. So we need to fight to change the leadership in the unions, not because changing someone at the top of the pyramid is going to change the whole structure, but the fight to do it raises consciousness, makes people aware of the problems, the need for radical solutions, and that there are people actually committed to providing them. They're going to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. So we need to be there. And parties that don't recognize the need to do that have reduced themselves to simply being voyeurs. They're just on the sidelines watching. But we think it's important for workers to engage in the struggle, where it's happening. And battles that occur in the NDP and in the unions and other important social justice movements, they matter. That's why we do it, because those struggles matter. They will determine how soon we will arrive at the time when working people can take our destiny in our hands. Hopefully it will be in time to save the world, to save civilization, to save the nature and the environment from the demise that corporate capitalism has in store for us. So we need to act quickly, but we have to be in the mass organizations of the working class. That's the sine qua non. We don't limit our work to the boundaries of the NDP or any given union or even the unions as a whole. There are millions of working people that don't belong to any union. So we need to activate them too. But we cannot overlook the importance of fighting in the main organizations of the working class. To ignore that is to make an error of grotesque proportions. We can't do that. We need to fight to win working people to socialism where they are. And I'm confident in the strength of our arguments that we will succeed.
But in defense, but in defense of the position that the SCP would take, or someone like Dimitri Lascaris, who's been on the show. Who's been on the show 3 times, who I know you've known personally at solidarity events against Venezuela and other reactionary policies. I'm sure that that somebody like them and maybe somebody such as myself would say, well, but when we have put all of our devotions into the NDP, look what the NDP has produced. So therefore, isn't it time that we build a completely new revolutionary union movement and join another party where where Dimitri Lascaris, okay, he didn't win the leadership race, but he did consistently get second place.
He lost the leadership race.
Yeah, he did. But second place, and who knows, maybe second time around.
The Green Party has changed the rules. They're not allowing policy resolutions that are specific in their content, and they're not going to allow what happened in 2016, where the Green Party convention delegates voted in favor of boycott, divestment, sanctions in relation to Israel for Palestine self-determination. They're not going to allow that to happen again. The person who won the leadership of the Green Party, Annemie Paul, did not even have the courtesy, the basic courtesy, to acknowledge the person who came in second and to wish him well. I like Dimitri very much as a person. I think that he's not only wasting his time but misleading people to think that the Green Party can be anything other than what it is, and that is a policy for green capitalism, for the profit system at the service of corporations that want to claim they're doing something for the earth and for civilization. And that fight will soon be over. Many people joined the Green Party just to vote for my good friend Dimitri. And they're now leaving the party in droves. Now, most of the Greens who were in it before the race will probably stay in it, but are they really going to enjoy a battle against the Annamie Paul, Elizabeth May party establishment for the next 2 or 3 years to try to change the Constitution in the direction of rank and file control, to try to open the road to policy debate that has been closed? You know, the world doesn't have time to squander on, being a lobbyist in a capitalist party. There are Greens in the Liberal Party. There are Greens in the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois. Should socialists go and join them too, and build an eco-socialist caucus in every party in the country? That would squander our meager resources. We need to build an eco-socialist revolutionary workers' party now. And we don't say that you have to join Socialist Action in order to fulfill that goal. We can bring together people from the Green Party, from the Bloc, from the left wing of the Liberals, even some oddball red Tories we might find, and together with socialists and labor militants build a party that will harness the strength of the growing eco-socialist movement. But to go into the Green Party to dissipate that movement.
So in your position of guys, I know that the NDP has done terrible things in the past, and I know that the NDP right now does not have an uninspiring leadership. But is your position of staying in the NDP or even joining the NDP to make it into the party it should be? Is it more like, okay, if we can't beat them, join them, but join to get rid of the, the Jagmeet Singhs of the world, the Tom Mulcairs of the world, and even the Jack Laytons and the David Lewises of the world?
Well,
that it's better to do that because the NDP already, as an institution, is the third major, has been, the third major political party in existence in Canada.
Youri, even if the NDP were not the third, but it was the fourth or the fifth or the sixth or the seventh major party in the country, I would still argue that is one place, not the only place. It is one place where socialists must fight to win working people to socialist policies. So the fact that the NDP is third, fourth, second, or first is not a decisive factor. The decisive factor is that it is a labor party. It's based on the trade unions. It's linked to the trade unions. If it didn't have the link to the trade unions, it would be of no greater interest to us than the Liberal Party, the Bloc, or the Green Party. The presence of the unions, the organic connection of the unions. By organic, I don't mean they pay contributions to the electoral war chest. I mean they send delegates elected by the union to argue for workers' needs in the party of the unions. So do we put all of our energy in that? No. I say no. I said no earlier. I repeat, no. It's important to be on the ground, in the streets, in the workplace, fighting for tenants' rights, transportation solutions, a Green New Deal, which is eco-socialist and based on public ownership of the commanding heights of the economy. That's where most of the energy should be. But the fact that there is an NDP in Canada and there isn't a Labour Party in the United States, and you lived in the United States for 8 years, you know how important the difference makes. It makes a huge difference. So parties that say that that's irrelevant, they're just isolated sects that are not going anywhere.
Because I think what you were trying to because what you were also saying was that it's not just the NDP that people should be focusing their energy to making it into the Socialist Party, the People Power Party it should be, but it's also all of those unions, which I know the World Socialist website has criticized a lot of union leaderships for being very much right wing and for being part of the problem. So it's not just that. So it's not just that people getting involved in the left movement, the people power movements, need to take over the NDP and make it into the party it should be, but it's also all the various unions you mentioned, correct?
Yeah, and you have to ask yourself, are those parties and grouplets that argue against voting for the NDP or working in it, are they building socialist or working class struggle caucuses in the unions? Or are they just denouncing the union leaders and standing back from the fray? We are involved in building rank and file caucuses in the unions. So we operate with our friends and allies in a formation called the Workers' Action Movement, WAM, Workers' Action Movement. And the Workers' Action Movement has a presence in about a dozen unions across Canada. And let me give you just one example of what it did. The Ontario Federation of Labour held its convention every 2 years. Its most recent convention was last November, 2019, a month after the federal election. And the Workers' Action Movement, in which Socialist Action participates, ran candidates for president and vice president of the Ontario Federation of Labour. Guess what percentage of the vote we got? Of the 1,000 delegates at the OFL convention a year ago.
I would say you got a very, very good wide majority of 50% of people in favor of what you were championing. Well,
obviously it wasn't a majority, because otherwise I'd be speaking to you now from the headquarters of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and we would have a dozen organizers, out there fighting class collaboration and concessions bargaining. No, but we got 36% of the votes, even though we had no budget for the campaign. Our candidates for president and vice president were activists of some months or years experience, but not long-standing, widely recognized militants, but just campaigning off the floor with a couple of brochures, able to get 36% of the votes. But the members of other left-wing tendencies who were present at the convention didn't help, didn't support, didn't vote for that campaign. They just stood on the sidelines and watched. But the delegates, they were inspired. And if you get 36% a year ago, maybe a year from now, we might be able to win. But win, lose, or draw, the purpose of the campaign is to raise awareness. And I ask, are the organizations that say that, they don't want to dirty their fingernails getting involved in policy battles in the NDP because they don't want to win, they don't care enough to win NDP voters and members to socialist policies, are they waging a similar fight in the unions? Because they cite the unions as being conservative led. So what are they doing? Or is it just talk?
Interesting. Well, I invite anyone from the World Socialist website or the SCP from Canada, if they want to come on to debate this in the future. I would love to organize something or have them say their counter arguments. But then I think in closing, I think one last thing I want to say, and I think you did a very good job making the case of why even though you may be frustrated with the NDP, it still is, it still is the institution that we need to fight in to make it into, what we want the world to be.
I don't think it'll ever be the institution. I don't think it's a certainty that it will ever be the institution that we want it to be. But we will win.
It's about people fighting in the streets. It's about actually having a movement in which they have to respond to that movement in order for us to save the planet before its extinction, as well as fighting on all of the important issues that you raised throughout our conversation.
Serious socialists will want to win working people everywhere to socialist ideas. And the NDP and the unions are just two places where that fight must occur. Otherwise, it's just not serious. So if you're serious if you recognize there can be no socialism without the working class, then you have to go where working people are organized in their own party or in their own unions and other mass organizations and try to convince them and try to win them to the socialist movement. The NDP will probably never be what working people need in terms of transforming capitalist society into a cooperative commonwealth, a socialist democracy. But the millions of NDP voters and the tens of thousands of NDP members who are essential to the success of the movement we seek to build and to triumph will be found there. And we cannot afford to ignore them. We need to go to them and convince them and to engage them in action. Together we will win.
And the one last thing I want to say before we close this conversation is that now I am critical of the NDP, as you are critical, as Dimitri Lascaris, as Eve Engler, and and others. But but in defense of the NDP, I imagine it. It's very it's also very difficult. When you're trying. When you want to be a proper left party. But you also have a media which is very much hostile towards you and keeps talking about and keeps framing everything in a classical liberal fashion with the because I've seen many I've seen all of the Canadian Prime Minister debates where even when Tommy Douglas was in power they kept talking about deficits and then when you have a society framed like that, then of course you're going to have a leader like Tom, Mulcair, who's going to be talking about balanced budget, this, and this is what was one of the questions I wanted to talk to you, because in fairness to Tom Mulcair, he finally did what the media is always demanding, what the establishment is always demanding the NDP. But then the Liberals got away with saying, "Oh, we're going to run deficits to pay for social programs," and it's a matter of why is it that the Liberals can get away with that kind of talk, and yet if an NDP leader was to campaign like that, the entire media establishment, the academia would depict that NDP leader as, you don't understand economics.
That's very interesting. So if the NDP, the Green Party, and the Liberals were advocating, even if they advocated exactly the same policies to the letter, the media would still ignore the NDP and would still promote the Liberals. And their second choice would be the Greens because it's a capitalist party. They don't trust the NDP, not because they think the leaders are not committed to capitalism. They know the leaders of the NDP are committed to capitalism, but they just don't trust the NDP base. It's too radical. It's too potentially autonomous. So we need to have our own media, which is why we publish Turn Left magazine.
Yeah.
Which is why we publish
Socialist Action
newspaper. And I encourage anyone watching this show to go and visit www.socialistaction.ca and find the articles in here and in here, and to write, to activate, to engage in the change that's going to make a difference in the places where the working class gathers to discuss what is to be done. That's the way forward. I invite everyone warmly to join with us. And
to also join the NDP Socialist Caucus, which you're a member of, if they believe that the NDP is still the place where where the fight for a better world is to be, as well as the broad people power movement which you champion.
Yeah, absolutely. Get involved. Don't watch, but argue, fight for, advance, stubbornly intervene, and history's on our side. It's just we need to make sure that we act wisely and prudently and rapidly to take advantage of the openings. Right now, a lot of young workers are joining the socialist movement. We can barely keep up with the interest that our work elicits, especially among workers in their teens, 20s, and early 30s. This is a great time to be alive, to fight for a revolutionary change, and we're not fixated on any one place where that argument, where that fight has to be waged, but we need to be engaged in all the decisive arenas where the future of the workers' movement will be determined. That's our message.
And before I end this, and before I end the interview, just out of curiosity, being an NDP member and seeing other, third and fourth left parties, which sometimes, instead of being the true alternative left parties they should be, they sometimes work hand in glove with they sometimes get co-opted into the capitalist system. In the U.S., who just out of curiosity, who would you vote for in this terrible race that's coming up? Would you vote third or fourth party, or hold the nose and vote for Joe Biden?
Well, I'll show you. I'll show you. I'm looking for the picture of our candidate for president of the United States.
Okay.
Our sister organization is running Jeff Maclaughlin, who is a retired teacher and a union organizer and a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the campaign to free America's most famous political prisoner, Mumia Abu-Jamal. And wouldn't you know it, I don't have his picture in the latest edition of our paper, but I would vote, with all four limbs. I would vote for Jeff Maclaughlin for president, and Anne Montague, who is, Jeff is in California, Anne is in Oregon. She's a leader of the Lavender Caucus in the Service Employees International Union. I would urge Americans to vote for Maclaughlin and Montague for the Socialist Action. It's a write-in ticket, so you have to write it in at the bottom of the ballot. It's better to vote for what you want and not get it than to vote for what you don't want and get it. That's what Eugene Debs say. That's what I say.
All righty. I think that's a perfect place to end it. So, ladies and gentlemen, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, another one of my favorite topics, all things Canada. And we were joined by Barry Weisleder, who is a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and he's a contributing editor to Socialist Action Canada. Barry, I'm also going to link to people your brilliant YouTube pages, in which I myself have asked questions on some of the live streams. And Jeff Maclaughlin has been in some of the panels, so people, if they're interested, they can. Our American viewers, if they're interested, they can check out Jeff there.
As a matter of fact, if I may,
yes,
on November the 5th, which is a Thursday, 2 days after Election Day in the United States, Jeff Maclaughlin will be the featured guest on the Socialist Action webcast. And you can access it just by going to www.socialistaction.ca, and there you'll find the link. And at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, November the 5th, 2 days after the election in the United States, Jeff will be the featured guest, and he'll be speaking on the topic, Is Democracy in America Over?
Perfect. And in another organization you want to recommend people join is Workers' Action Movement, right?
Yeah, the Workers' Action Movement has a website. It's all about working together. Marxists, Social Democrats, anarchists. We have many anarchist brothers and sisters who are involved in WAM, fighting to wham it to the bosses and transform our unions in a militant democratic direction.
And I'm going to wish you the best of luck in all those campaigns. I'm going to make sure that I link to all of that when I upload this onto YouTube. So on that note, Barry, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations, because I'm a big fan of Socialist Action Canada. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And I invite anyone who disagrees with Barry, if they want to come on and we debate where does the left go. Yeah, I definitely welcome that debate. But until then, Barry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Youri.
Really,
you're wonderful. Thank you very much. My pleasure. All the best.
Really appreciate it. And
solidarity forever.
Power to the people, and the people united will never be defeated. And death to the fascist pigs.
Right on.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.